Welcome to this presentation called Automating Your Life with Jenkins. I noticed as I looked through the schedule that tomorrow morning there is another Jenkins talk named Jenkins 101. So I decided to rename mine to Jenkins 100 because I come first. So, who am I? My name is Michael Hawley. I'm a DevOps engineer. I know DevOps should not be in a title, but that's what my title is. When people ask, like, what's a DevOps engineer? It's basically a system administrator who does some programming. So that's what I do. If you want, I'm not a very online social kind of person. So I have a Twitter account. I never use it. This is my website where some of my stuff ends up, and I'm hoping to update soon. Just haven't got there. This is who I work for. I work for an AWS partner, and their focus is on development automation workflows. So if you watch this and you're like, hey, Jenkins is cool, but you need help at work, this is the company that you could hire to help you work on your development needs in the AWS space. And now that I should also note that if you like doing DevOps automation, sysadmin programming kind of stuff, we are hiring. So you can talk to me and
you do remote work?
I work 100% remote.
Outstanding.
Yep, I live in Utah. The company's based out of New York. So works great. All right, so first question. Who here has never used Jenkins? All right, there is enough people here that I have to go through the introduction slides. So enjoy for everybody else. Jenkins is an open source CI/CD. Now CI/CD is a buzzword. It means continuous integration, continuous development or deployment automation platform, which I'm sure makes a whole lot of sense. So to break that down, Jenkins is open source. Hopefully I don't need to tell anybody here what open source means. It's continuous integration. It automatically builds and runs tests on your code. So you commit a change, it builds and runs. That's what continuous integration means. These terms are how I define them. I'm sure other people will have complaints about that, but this is how I define these terms. Continuous deployment or development means that the code that automatically gets built and tested gets staged somewhere, so someone can go look at the code automatically. That's what the continuous development. Continuous deployment is that the code gets deployed to prod automatically. No one has to do anything. And, there we go. And automation means everything is done automatically. So Jenkins is a CI/CD server that automatically deploys your code. Yep. So basically, Jenkins is a highly customizable, extendable, enterprise-grade platform that runs a bunch of bash scripts automatically. And that really is what Jenkins is. So if you know how to write bash scripts, it's really powerful to use. So now, as I mentioned in the title, how can you use Jenkins? Excuse me. The title was using Jenkins to automate your life. I don't know how many of you are developers and who actually use Jenkins or a CI/CD tool to build your software, but I was thinking, like, I run a Jenkins server in my house. And I was thinking, how do I use this and how could other people use Jenkins for themselves? One, if you're using a static site generator like Hugo or Jekyll, all you have to do is you can write your code in your website in Markdown, push it to GitHub, and it automatically builds it and deploys it for you. So you don't actually have to have the app on your computer. You just write in Markdown, save it, push it, and it deploys it for you really easily. So that's one option I'm in the process of building for my own website. You can centralize a cron server. Now, this is something I stumbled across. In my last job, we had a dedicated cron server. It was just a Linux box that had a lot of cron files and cron tabs and for different users, and we had 2 of them, and then we got really confused when someone's like, hey, can you add a cron? We're like, where do we need to put it? And we discovered something really cool about having Jenkins be a cron server. One, if you've ever run cron jobs before and they fail, who gets notified? You don't know half the time when they fail unless you're one of those guys who has like this big heading at the top of your cron file that does like sends emails out and everything like that. Most of the time it fails, you have no idea. It succeeds, you don't know either unless you see the output. With putting your cron in Jenkins, you just go to Jenkins and it will have a green for a pass or a red through a bad, fail. You're like, oh, great, I can see if it fails or pass. And you can also get the log output of your cron. And you don't have to grep through your syslog to try to find it. So really cool. And if you're like me, I have more computers in my house than people. I have cron in a lot of places, and it would be nice to just stick them all in one so I don't have to think, okay, well, this cron's on the cron tab of this machine, but this cron's in the Etsy cron D in this machine, and figuring all that out. You can also automate tasks at work. A buddy of mine, he has a job doing something highly automatable, but the job requires him to do it manually because that's the way it's always been done. And he spends half of his week just doing this thing, and it drives him mad. So I'm like, install Jenkins on your local box, build a job, and have it do it for you. And then when everyone comes back to you, he's like, you're doing this job that used to take half your time, and it's doing it in a quarter of that. What are you doing? Oh, I'm using Jenkins. Then he can actually be able to lobby to actually have a Jenkins server. So that was one task you can use it. This one, honestly, I came up with this one when I was like, how else could I use this? You could just have a job with all your scripts, install these apps, set these things up, configure these things, and then when you set up a new box, you could just say, run that job, and it pops a prompt that says, what's the IP address? You type in the IP address of your new machine, it SSH in, and then configures it all for you, and you got an easy way to do that if you already have a Jenkins server. A buddy of mine got into building snaps, and so he'll go find any app out there. He's like, oh, this is useful, and then he builds a snap for it. You could do that at home, iterate really fast so you don't have to push it to the Snapcraft servers, wait for it to come back. Once you got it working, then you can push it to the Snap store. By the way, if anyone cares, he built the Minecraft launcher, MC-installer. If anybody likes Minecraft, he built that snap. And finally, you can have it curl the EFF's webpage, find out what the current issues is, and email your representatives every day. Works in Shawshank Redemption. I'm sure it's going to work this way too. So that is some use cases you can totally use Jenkins to do. Now, Jenkins getting running. There's actually a couple ways you can run Jenkins. So you can have a dedicated server and slaves and do all that, but it's actually really easy just to install it on your own box. All you have to do is make sure you have Java, and you can use the OpenJDK. And then as you can see here, I'm creating a repo, or I'm creating in the Ubuntu parlance, setting up a repository and just installing Jenkins. And then using system control to start it. So you can install it on Metal, or you could just run it inside Docker. If you got Docker on your box, just Docker pull Jenkins, and then you run it, and now you got it on your box. Either way is great. The nice thing with Docker, you don't have to install Java on your computer. The bad thing about Docker, you have a daemon always running that takes resources even when you aren't running Jenkins. But Red Hat just recently released a tool called Podman that lets you start up Docker containers without a Docker daemon. So now you get the benefit of not having Java on your computer and not having a daemon running all the time. Unfortunately, I didn't write down the instructions for using Podman, but that was a really cool thing. Now, when you're running Jenkins, once you get Jenkins running, they have this mentality of a master and a slave, or a master and a node, because they don't want to insult people and call them slaves. I don't know. But so you have this master and a node mentality. And by default, the master is also a node. You can separate out, if you get really big into Jenkins, you can have separate nodes that do different things. But for simplicity, we'll just leave the master and the node the same. Once you get a Jenkins server, you create Jenkins jobs. This is an example of the old style of Jenkins job. It's called a freestyle job. This is what it looks like, and it is bare bones. This is just the freestyle job, and I added one little thing to it. And that is this big long page that's stuck in a GUI. But in about August of 2016, CloudBees, who's the corporate sponsor of Jenkins, came out with something called Pipeline, which is powered by a file called a Jenkins file that lives with your code. So that same thing that I just scrolled, this is what it would look like in Jenkins file. It has kind of a JSON YAML look. It's more like YAML in that you don't have semicolons everywhere, but it's more like JSON because you have curly braces everywhere. So you just basically define what you want it to do, and it just does it for you. And the beauty of this, it lives with your code, so you don't have to worry about going into web UI and finding the configuration and clicking buttons. You just, hey, do this thing, and it does it. So what I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation about is talking about how to write a Jenkins file. Because this is, getting Jenkins installed, super easy. Writing a Jenkins file, it took me 6 months to figure out how to get this to work. And then once I figured it out, I spent the next 2 years of my working career just diving into Jenkins. And I did almost everything you can do except an actual Jenkins plugin and building out this whole workflow for my company. So I wanted to distill some of the things I learned in that process. So there are two types of Jenkins files that you're going to run across. If you're going to Google, how do I do this? I did this a lot. This is a phrase, Jenkins file if I would just do this keyword search. Two results will come back. There are two kinds. There's scripted, which is what they first did, and then declarative, which is okay, now that we've figured this out, this is what we want people to use. So scripted was first released. It is a mix of the Jenkins DSL, which DSL stands for Domain Specific Language. That is, they took Groovy, excuse me, and took kind of its syntax and made their own little language based off of Groovy. And that's what the DSL is. So in a scripted, you could use their custom functions and raw Groovy, which Groovy is just a scripted form of Java. And since Jenkins is written in Java, that's why they made that choice. So declarative is the syntax they wanted everyone to use going forward. The reason why, it is a static language. It is something that you can say, the main reason, it's lintable. So they can say, you've misspelled something, you put something in the wrong place. Whereas with Groovy, there's a lot of ways to do something in Groovy. So declarative is what they want you to do. And the nice thing about declarative, you don't need to learn Groovy. It's a lot easier to jump in and do simple things with it. And declarative only uses the Jenkins file DSL. It won't allow you to put Groovy in it. If you really get into this, you're going to want to learn both. But you can definitely start with the Jenkins declarative and get a lot of mileage out of it. So as I mentioned, declarative is the future. It can be linted. It only supports the DSL. It's easy to learn, but there is limited functionality. For example, you can't do if statements. You can't do if this, then this. And you can't do variables because that's more programish. This is more declarative of do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. However, I have found workarounds for most of that when I was working with declarative. And when you're looking at code examples, the nice thing is all declaratives will start with a pipeline line. It'll say pipeline, open curly brace, and then have the content. So that's an easy way to visually say, oh, I'm looking at a declarative syntax. Here's an example. This is functional. This will, if you were to run this, it would totally work right now. Scripted was the initial one. It can't be linted. It's a mix of Groovy. You have to, this is why it took me so long, because I had to learn Groovy. Because I'm like, how do I create variables and so forth? But you can do a whole lot more with Groovy. Yes, sir?
But you have to keep in mind that it's not plain Groovy.
That's true.
Things that you can do in plain Groovy that you can't do in
Yep, that's a good point. It is sandboxed, so there are some things where it'll let you do it, but it has to run in sandbox. And there's just some things Jenkins says, no way am I going to let you run that Groovy function. But a lot of it does work. Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah.
You just said that you can't do variables in declarative statements, but you have variables.
Yes and no. What you're seeing right here is not a variable. It is an environment variable. You can't do a Groovy variable where I just
you can do environment variables.
with you. Yes, there is some limitations on that, so it's not a one-to-one match. But you can, like I said, I've found workarounds. You can use an environment variable like you see here in the environment one that does 90% of what a Groovy variable can do. But there is slight differences.
Well, for us Linux shell scripting types, that's about all we need.
Oh, you're absolutely right.
For those of us in here, which isn't me, that are developers, I'm sure they can do much more complicated things.
Right.
But for me, that's going to suffice for everything I need to do.
9 times out of 10 that works.
Yeah.
There is occasions where you need the variable inside of Groovy, not inside of the shell. And that's where it's a pain point. Yes, sir?
So is scripted going to be discontinued in the future?
You know what? I've looked into that. So for those, I guess maybe for my microphone, will scripted be discontinued in the future? I've looked at it, and I don't believe so. At least not currently. They really are pushing for people to use declarative, and they're deprecating scripted. But I don't think they're going to get rid of it because there is still a use case for it. And from what I can gather, so I went to Jenkins World a year after they announced, the year after they announced this, and it was like pulling teeth to get people to even learn about declarative. They're just like, hey, you guys should do this. You're like, nah, I got everything in script. I ain't touching that. I'm like, okay. So if they're going to get rid of it, you got a long stretch before they do. And one thing I wanted to note, in declarative, you can see that it starts with pipeline. In scripted, it starts with node. And node is referring to the build node. So it says, get a build node, now do this thing. Pipeline, it defines the node later.
For what it's worth, I started out using declarative, and I've never even knew that I was missing anything.
I wish I would have learned. I started and all there was scripted. And then all of a sudden, like as I was getting everything figured out, declarative just popped up. And I'm like, what is this? And I realized I needed to rebuild everything. Yes, sir.
Well, one of the flexibilities is that you can do things on the map that don't have to be used.
Right.
Can you do that in declarative?
Yes. Yes, you can. And I'll get to that when I'm talking about namespaces. So the anatomy of a Jenkins file, you start with pipeline. So you're saying, once that kicks over, Jenkins now says, okay, I'm evaluating a pipeline script. I have seen some developers who are, like you, a little bit smarter than me and did stuff. They put Groovy above this, and it doesn't, and it would pass because it wasn't within the pipeline block. So you might be able to get away with some of that too. The first line after pipeline is the agent. or the node. You're defining where you execute your code. We are now in the global namespace. Right now, in this sample, I set agent as none. That means in the global namespace, don't do anything on any build agent. And the reason I do this, I've learned, is for flexibility. Because for whatever reason, declarative, it is the global overrides the local. So if I declare later, hey, I want you to run on this build server over here, the global will override it. Except when it says agent none, at which case it just doesn't do anything and you can override it all over the place. But if I said like agent any, so any build agent that's available, run it, and then down later I said, no, I want you to run on agent X over here, it will totally ignore that agent X and it'll run on any. So that's why I right up here I said agent none. Next, you have to specify your stages. In a freestyle job, that would be a stage is a single build job. So in the old Jenkins, you would have a freestyle job, another freestyle job, like 3 jobs, and you would link them together. So this one runs, it triggers the next one, and that triggers the following one. In Jenkinsfile, it's all in one big file. So I have a stage, so I have my stages, and then inside of that, I have a stage, like my first thing I'm going to do. Now, as you can see, I'm now specifying you can work on any agent. If you don't include this here, nothing will happen because it doesn't know where to attach to do the work. And then you tell it what you want it to do. And here is where a bunch of bash scripts come into play. You just say sh, that's the command. So sh is a DSL function. I'm saying use whatever is in the quotation marks, run this as a shell script. And then there we go. That is a valid Jenkins file. Yes, sir.
Can I use other interpreters like sh, like Python, and then run something underneath that if that's my interpreter?
Yeah, no, okay.
Or shebang?
No. So what you would have to do is do sh,
Yeah.
and then Python run this. So it hits a shell, opens a shell, and then it does whatever you want. Yeah.
So here.
No, go ahead.
So here you have steps sh. So normally that's like standard POSIX shell, right?
Yeah.
So this actually isn't going to run in Bash. It's going to run in sh.
No.
Right?
It's going to run on whatever is the default shell for
Default shell.
that for your
Okay.
slave.
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you're running this if you had a slave as a Windows server, you would be bat, and then it would run PowerShell. Yes, sir.
Doesn't it run the sh command?
No. This is just
That was my question.
this is a DSL function to say open the shell on the client.
So what
And the
the
default shell is for that user because it's going to be executing as the Jenkins user. So if you define the Jenkins user to use ZHS, for example, when you do this, it's going to run it in a ZHS shell. Any other questions on that?
One of the things I've noticed is that people seem to do some level of interpretation, like if you split up shell pipeline. Is that fit with your experience?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking.
Yeah, I'm trying to describe it.
A multi-line shell script, you use 3 quotes at the beginning and the end of it on a separate line, and it'll run that all as a single shell script. If you actually call it as separate components, like you have multiple lines that say shell.
Oh yeah, because every time you run this line, it creates a new shell. And so whatever,
I'm talking about within one sh call.
Three quotes in the beginning, it's called constant. And it's basically three quotes, everything in between is moving. So it starts to
Sure,
interpret the interior.
right. That's right. I understand. That's not what I'm talking about. But sorry, I just am trying to describe.
well, if you want, you can think about it and talk to me, and I can try to. I've run into a lot figuring this out. Trying to figure out how to escape quotation marks is just a beast. Sometimes you're like, I want you to pass this quotation mark, but not this one.
Can you do octal like you can in occ?
What do you mean?
Like 0x047 would be a single quote or something like that.
Oh no, I haven't. I haven't noticed that. It.
Okay. It's Java. This is all running in the Java.
Yeah.
And so
string works. Groovy has some string rules, but they're really the JVM rules. And so
Yeah.
if you're wondering how to get how to get hex codes in or how to get module code in, it's / and it's something. So there's an escape.
Yeah. So I'm going to expand on this one. I'm going to add a little bit more. So we've had the first stage. It ran hello world. Okay. Now another cool thing we can do is I've added a second stage. It's just going to automatically flow from the first to the next. If you notice this one, I set it back to agent none. Agent none means that it is what's called the light. It's not hypervisor. I forgot what it's called. Executor. It's running on the master node, but not in a workspace. So So when you're running when you have a build executor, a build node, it has certain number of lanes. By default, when you fresh install Jenkins, the master server is a node with 2 lanes. If you have 2 build jobs running, everything else gets queued. As you get a lot of demand, you start farming out to more slaves, give them more resources, you can have more executor lanes, and things start to flow. Light executors don't have queues. The master just takes care of it. So when I said agent none, it's rolling it back to the master, and this step I have here is an input. So it's going to ask a question. Do you want to keep going? And then it's going to wait for a reply. You don't want this to happen on your build executor. Or while you're waiting for a reply, nobody else can build anything. I ran into that one a lot. This is the major reason why I don't put agent any at the very top. I say agent none, so that way that pops out of an execution queue and then just waits for you in the Jenkins UI. And then, as you can see in this example here, in my second action, I'm specifying a different agent. So agent any goes to anything, but let's say I have a Windows server and I don't want this to be executed on the Windows server. I want it to be executed on my Linux node. So you can specify your node. And as mentioned before about environment variables, you can see here I'm creating a local environment variable called local var and assigning it a string called foo. You can do this at the stage level. So if I were to request this in stage 3, try to pull that var variable, it would be gone because it's scoped to just that stage. If you put the environment block at the very beginning, right after that first agent none, then every stage has access to it. So anything after pipeline and before stages is global. And then once you get into the individual stages, it's just local at that point. And you can see here in this is me having to, I can't point that far, but with my quotation marks, trying to escape the right kind because I needed to escape the single quotes into it so it would then reference that as an actual variable. That will bite you. And I've learned to just keep adding single quotes or keep removing and switching them around to get them to work.
You've got smart quotes in there. Will that throw the program?
Oh no, that's just because I wrote the code in this text editor. Yeah, don't use smart quotes. It errors. I copied this and pasted it. Didn't like it. Yeah.
I was going to say, can you alter a global variable? So if you define a global variable initially, I'm guessing you can. Then during one of the steps you can write to it.
Yes, you can. And I have done that. I have defined them globally and then overwritten them locally, and they keep the local change global, so the next one can use that. Yep, absolutely. So this little sample build I just showed you, this is what it looks like using the Blue Ocean UI. So the default Jenkins UI doesn't look like this, but they created this new UI called Blue Ocean, which was optimized for pipeline. So you got the first action. The really cool thing about this UI is it breaks up the log into each of the stages. So every command you execute, it capsulizes the log output into these little boxes. So when you have, a stage that does, 10 different things, it will capture, and each command will have its own little block. So that way you can just key into that one instead of reading this massive log. Yeah?
You can't also do that in traditional UI.
What's that?
That is also available in this.
You're right. It is. It just makes it really easy to see with Pipeline, with the Blue Ocean UI. So this is what it looks like when you get the input. Everything goes blue. It's waiting for an answer. This input, it doesn't just have to be yes/no question. You can have multiple choice. You can have text fields. You can have checkboxes. You can do some really cool stuff with that. As I mentioned before, 9 times out of 10, creating a local environment variable totally works. Where it doesn't work is when you want to take if you have a question here and you can have a string. For example, let's say I created a Jenkins file and it asks for an IP address of which machine you want to set up. Well, I have to take the results of that string and store it so I can do something with that. That's where environment variables do not work. And in which case you have to bounce back to a Groovy variable to capture it, and then you can write to environment variable and use it later. And then here's my second action, and then it finishes. So that's the basics of writing a Jenkins file. Yes?
For that question, can
Yeah.
you populate a variable inside of the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. You could totally take information from a previous stage and then dynamically change the questions. Yeah, absolutely. I did a job where the guy wanted his build to do a search in the GitHub repo, look for folder names, and then populate which folder do you want to build. So I would do a git pull, get the code on there, find all the directory names, stick those in variables as an array, then pipe it through. So yeah, you could totally do that. So when you're building with Jenkins, okay, I'm talking really fast. Okay, when you're building with a Jenkins file, you can, okay, thank you. Gotta look at my screen. It comes with basic functions. You know, you can do an sh command, you can do whatnot. By adding plugins, it gives you more functions. So most new plugins now, they build in the DSL, the pipeline DSL specific functions into their plugin, and just by installing the plugin, they're now available to you to use. So that's one way to extend your Jenkins file to get more functionality. I was doing a job where I needed to push code to S3. Well, the first way I looked at it, it's like, well, I guess I need to drop to Groovy, make an HTTP connection, and do I drop to a shell and do a curl command and then push it. No, there's a plugin. So all I had to do is the S3 deploy file, and it just did it for me. So that's one way to do that. The second way, when you install a plugin, you can see what functions are available to you. So this is the classic Jenkins UI. I'm in a project. And you can see at the bottom, there's pipeline syntax. You click on that, and you get what's called the snippet generator, which is a great way to start figuring out how to do stuff with the Jenkins file. Because this sample step, you just click on it, and it will show you every single function it knows about. So every single plugin that says, hey, I know a pipeline function, it just populates this. So you can go, I need to upload to S3. I need to SSH into a client. I need to write a file to the file system. I need to read in a file. This one is dir. I need to change directories and do execute commands inside that directory. So you select it. It says, hey, where's the path to that directory? I type it, hit generate pipeline script, and it just pushes out the code. It's like copy and paste this into your pipeline, into the steps block, and then add your code in between, and you're good to go. So it makes it really easy. I come here all the time. When I was teaching our developers about this, they're like, how do I do this? Let me show you the snippet generator. Really nice. And the nice thing about this, you can always find it. If you have your Jenkins server, so jenkins.com, whatever your Jenkins server is, /pipeline-syntax. If you just tack that onto the end of anything, it will pull up that page. So if you do it under a job, You do it under the root, you can find the snippet generator there. Now, the other thing that was really valuable to me as writing Jenkins files, this is more, a little less stuff I do at my house and a little bit more stuff I do at my job, is writing shared libraries. So I had, when I was creating our Jenkins files for my job, I had 10 commands, actually it was more like 50 commands I wanted to execute on every single build. And it was like creating environment variables, figure out where your GitHub repo is, and setting the node environment variables and stuff like that. I wanted every single one to be done. And instead of copying and paste this huge block in the beginning of every single Jenkins file, I created a shared library. And all I had to do inside of every Jenkins file is like init, open, close parens, and I was done. And anytime they would run their Jenkins file, I hit that init stage, and it would go and generate all these environment variables that they needed throughout the build process. So shared libraries are really good at sharing used code. One thing I started doing is you can write your own wrappers. So let's say you have a shell command, and you don't want to your people who are writing these Jenkins files, you don't need to really want them to worry about, okay, you call this command, you have to be in this kind of syntax, you call the flag this way. You just want them to say, like I was developing one for AWS deploy. AWS deploy has a lot of functions. All I want them to do is AWS deploy and a timeout. I'll take care of the rest because I know how I want this to be deployed. So you can write your own wrapper around a shell command. So you could just say, these are the only options I want you to give me, and I will format the rest of it inside of the shared library. Reuse common code, as I mentioned. Now, shared libraries are typically written in scripted format. You can write them in declarative, but it really is helpful if you have Groovy here, because then you can do more programmer-y things in your work. So, quick tip for writing shared libraries. This right here is what blocked me for 6 months. All shared libraries start with def call open and close parentheses. That was what I didn't know. And I could not figure anyone to tell me out. There are two kinds of shared libraries. There's a vars shared library and a source shared library. Source is 100% Groovy. You can't easily execute it. It's kind of like they added it there for the guys who don't want to write full plugins, but really want to write full plugins. And when I went to Jenkins World and I asked people about it, they're like, yeah, don't touch that one. Just use the vars kind. Because the vars kind is just the scripted or declarative format. It's still super easy and very functional. And the vars format starts this way. You define a call. If you want to, and this is how you would call it in your Jenkins file. So this file, I didn't specify this. So where this shared library is just called foo.groovy, I just call it, say, foo, and it knows about it. If you want to get fancy and pass a lot of environment variables into it, you can use a map, or in the Python world, it's called a dictionary. And so you pass in all your config options. As you can see here, I just do config.name. .name is the key, and I give it a value, and then I can execute off of it. This is really good if you have to pass it a lot of variables, but you don't have to make them a certain order. Like, okay, I need a name, I need a source, I need 4 or 5 different things. And this way you don't have to specify the order. Whereas if you just did it as a traditional, here's a method and I'm putting in arguments, passing them into the function, then they have to be in a certain order. So that was a really cool thing. And this is how you would call it. We have foo, name has the key, and then the value. Yes?
How is the foo related to the call over on the left?
So this is what the file name is called.
Oh,
So
the name of the file.
yeah,
Okay.
the function name is the file name. So I didn't put that in my slide, and I apologize. So in this case, it would be wherever your shared library is, it would be foo.groovy. And that's what the function name would be called. Now, here are the documentation I found really helpful when I was learning. Their documentation's pretty good, they assume a little bit of knowledge, and that's what got me stuck for so long. Once I got that little bit of knowledge, then their docs were actually really good. Declarative syntax, like I mentioned before, it is pretty stock. It is defined. It's declarative. There's not a lot to it, so you could read through the doc and know all the functions it can do, and you can get a lot of mileage off of just declarative. Yes?
Are you going to have a link to this slide somewhere at the end?
I don't have it anywhere, but I can make it available. Yeah. I was finishing this last night, so I haven't published it anywhere. The snippet generator, like I said, just pipeline dash syntax at the end. And when writing shared libraries, this docs actually gives a lot of help and tips on how to write good shared libraries. And most important is just have fun with it. I didn't realize that I loved developer automation until I started writing in Jenkins. And I come home every day, I'm like, God, I love my job. And then I got a new one, and now I've been training forever. But it will get...
Do you also use declarative configuration for Jenkins?
I'm not sure what you mean.
There's a way to, instead of having to go through the GUI and set things in the settings page.
Oh, yeah. There's a command line to Jenkins.
Something like that for Jenkins.
Yeah, I've never done that, so I don't know. Yeah, I've heard about it though.
Yeah, I was going to mention something that's kind of important. If
Okay.
you set up one of these Jenkins servers and you want to make it like available on the internet, I know a lot of companies have done this. But A, that's something you have to be very, very careful about.
Yeah.
You definitely want to, it doesn't have TLS by default. You have to add that.
Yeah.
You have to update it constantly. But there's one other thing that's extremely important. In Jenkins, you can add credentials for logging into all your services.
Yep.
Now, it's running as the Jenkins server, and when you run anything on the master node, it's running under the Jenkins user,
Right.
which has access to all the files.
Right.
I can write a 3-line declarative script that will capture all of the secrets and send them wherever I want them and completely duplicate your Jenkins server.
Yep.
So what you have to do is much like making another external node on another Linux server, add another user to your master box where you're running Jenkins, turn off the executor nodes for the master box, and then have it log in to itself, to the same machine as that other user, and then give that executors.
Right.
Then it can actually run, and it can't steal the secrets from itself.
Yeah.
If
There's.
you have other users using your Jenkins server, you really want to do that. Otherwise, they can steal all of your secrets.
That's true, and I don't have a section on hardening Jenkins, but you definitely. I've only ever run it on an internal network because we just heard about a big exploit with Jenkins because someone didn't patch the plugin, and it was an attack vector. They can get it. So, yeah, be careful about that.
You kind of touched on 2 questions then. So, can you have variables in the Jenkins file that are actually point to credentials? So, like if you want to look at password field, it actually be a credential that's pulled in from somewhere.
Absolutely. So.
It is a credential database.
Yeah. So
Okay.
Jenkins has a credential store. So you can put a credential into it. It keeps it encrypted, but this man said, use still the Jenkins user, so you have access to it. But within your Jenkins file, in the environment variable block, he says, here's my variable, and it is a credential. Here's the ID of the credential.
Okay.
And it will just suck it down into that environment variable, and then you can call it inside your scripts.
And then just when these jobs run, are they run, so they just run straight flat on the server? There's no containerization at all? Or it's just so... anything
Not by
that
default.
effect, or-
Not by default. You can totally, and this is what I did a lot in my last job, is you can actually, in your Jenkins file, says, hey, in this stage, run in this Docker image.
And you can
Or
pass
run
it-
this
yeah.
Docker file, and it will run inside of that container. So you can do it. By default, it doesn't do that. Yes, sir.
The one thing that I found as administration is Jenkins is very much a pest. How do you make it so that it's infinitely reproducible without having to have that shared directory that I have to copy everywhere?
Well, that's what I was talking about. Configuration.
I want to have a multi-master. I want to have 3 Jenkins servers.
Right.
And I don't want to have to,
Jenkins says code.
You know what? And so what's interesting is if you contacted CloudBees and you said, I'm going to pay the ridiculous price that you request for support. It is ridiculous. But if you were to pay that, we looked into it, was like $10,000 a year. Yeah, it was ridiculous. But what you get then is they actually set up a Kubernetes cluster, and they run the master and all the slave nodes inside of it. So there are definitely ways to do that. I never got around to that. I would probably, I set up the slave node in CloudFormation because I use AWS. You could do something in Terraform if you're anywhere else, or in AWS as well. And you can define using user scripts. Jenkins has an API.
So do you store stuff in S3?
Yep. So we actually have a Jenkins job that backs up the Jenkins home folder and zips it and puts in S3.
It actually, Jenkins has the ability to put its configuration into a Git or GitHub.
Right.
By default.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So which was, we're really grateful we backed up our Jenkins server because one time all of our Jenkins jobs got deleted by a bad remove command, and we just had to jump up to our S3, put them all back, and then all of our jobs came back online. So, you can definitely, it is possible. It is not push button easy, but it is totally possible.
It takes about 5 commands, I can tell you.
Yeah.
To clone a Jenkins server somewhere else.
Yeah. And it takes 3 lines in declarative script to do it for you. So you just have the hackers come in and back it up, just know where they took it. And that is my presentation. So,
Quick question.
yes.
I noticed you were recording this.
Yes.
Are you going to put this up on your site?
I will.
Okay, outstanding. Because I was kind of pretty good talk, by the way. And
Thank you.
I definitely like to reference back to it.
Absolutely.
But I can't watch you talk and take notes at the same time.
I know.
I'm multitasking,
Yeah,
so.
and I'm going to push this all. I'm going to put all this into a GitHub. It's probably a GitLab repo with my slides and some sampled Jenkins files on how I do stuff. It's just we're right in the middle of moving, so I didn't have time to get that all finished up before this. But that will all go onto my website with this video. And I also wrote up about a 10-page doc of everything I learned on writing shared libraries.
Sweet.
And I'll put all that stuff out there as well.
Can you put your link to your to your website up
Yep.
again?
I bet it will work if I do that.
Out of curiosity, have you ever used Concourse?
No.
Okay. I was curious what your opinion was. 'Cause
I've-
I love using Concourse and I love and hate it at the same time.
That's a build tool as well.
Yeah, it is. It's just like a CIC.
Yeah, I'm like, that sounds
It's in
familiar.
Go. It's in Go.
Oh,
Yeah. It's self-contained.
Fancy.
It's everything in a database.
That's
Right.
kind of cool, though, if it's a Go, because you can run it anywhere. If it's
Yeah.
a Go.
Yep.
I use Git instead of GitLab or GitHub.
Right.
And one of the great things I
I
love
use it
about
too.
it is it's written in Go, and I can run it everywhere.
Upgrade your-
I run it on Raspberry Pis, it's in the cloud, and it doesn't matter. I can run it anywhere I want to run it. So
absolutely.
Upgrade is you just replace the binary.
Yep.
That's all you do. And then you
It's
start it.
really cool, but anyways.